Anyway, as you all, we've been able to introduce Dr. Mary Mumbach before here to you all, so just to remind you, she's spent much of her career at Thomas More College, Thomas More Institute, later Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in New Hampshire, where an innovative curriculum composed by Donald and Louise Cowan was instituted, one very different from our own and not centered on individual disciplines, but rather designed for a small college in which there could be greater integration of the student body for discussions and so forth. And so it was one that asked all students to come to a central lecture that was happening every semester, and that would follow a chronological path, with 4 years, beginning in antiquity, medieval, modern, and American.
Early American, yes.
I think that was it. And didn't matter. It didn't matter what part of the cycle you came in, right? So you could come in as a freshman, and they'd be discussing the modern world, and that'd be okay, because you're going to integrate it in a timeless medium, namely your mind. So, and this is what worked wonderfully. There were contests in bars, I can remember, in Rome, I believe, in which students who went to both, some who went to UD and some who went to Thomas More, talked about their knowledge of the classics, and UD was blown away by Thomas More many times. So it proved to be something that just inculcated itself in a wonderful way. Sadly, the way of the world prevailed, and their way is no longer taught. I would say Uncle Sam, our image of American currency prevailed, possibly. Maybe the Yankee spirit is what we can blame it on. I don't know what it is, but at any rate, she has become a sage, certainly during her time at Thomas More, and now very much reflectively on her own life. And we're so glad to have her here revisiting University of Dallas for one of her all too rare visits. She has, of course, written extensively on Faulkner, and especially on the Mansion, as the last part and culminating part of the trilogy, the Snopes trilogy. And here, I think, without further ado, I should say, I'm going to hand this over to you, Mary, and let you take us through these chapters, chapters 7 through 12, that I believe we're covering this time.
Well, it just strikes me that this makes me think about what the objections to the curriculum that we had at Thomas More. One of them being that they didn't all start and go in chronological order in studying humanities. So as you say, if they came in at modernity, they started there, and this was suggested by Dr. Donald Cowan, because we had 12 students to begin with, and they were at 3 different levels. And we said, we can't run 3 different humanities courses. That wouldn't even be preferable. And he said, why don't you do what we did to start with the doctoral program at university? And that was, everybody jumped on the merry-go-round wherever it was when they got in. And so that's what we did at first. And then afterward, we had people saying, change that and you might as well close your doors. It became such a distinctive aspect of the education that happened, and it was a quick orientation for freshmen. So now we're starting with the last volume of the Snopes trilogy here. And that presents some problems, but so does starting with the beginning, those of you who read the Hamlet. And so, yeah, anyway, that was, but I think still this novel is worth reading on its own, and then maybe you'll go back, if you haven't read it already, as many of you probably have, though. And so we have, so the title is already something of a problem in that it's a question. Why did he call it The Mansion? There are 3 distinct mansions in the novel that are obvious, and one of them is reference to the old Frenchman's place, which is in ruins by the time this novel starts. And then another is the mansion, the Despain mansion, which Flem takes over in his progress toward wealth and respectability. And then we have the mansion that Gavin, we haven't gotten to that point yet, but when he marries the widow Melisandre, he becomes the master of this household, which was actually gained through ill-gotten goods, because her first husband had gangster connections, and yes, so that was really, so he's kind of in a difficult situation being a lawyer to now benefit from those criminal activities. So this is sort of the paradox that we see repeated in the mansion throughout. Is this loud enough? Then it's okay? Okay, so the mansion, we could argue, is one of the most complex of Faulkner's novels. Completing the action of the Snopes trilogy, it gathers together the patterns and types within the other 2 novels of the trilogy, the mythic and Hellenic, the allegorical and Christian, to allow their fullest examination and extension. The meanings of this trilogy are revealed in an analogical way, like that of Dante and other writers of the medieval tradition, specifically, rather than in the highly symbolic mode characteristic of Faulkner's earlier novels. The action of the trilogy, in particular the last novel of it, could be considered as symbolizing the decline of the West, the end of the modern world, or the triumph of amoral rapacity. And in fact, his original title for it was Ilium Falling. So, yeah. And it could be considered as symbolizing the decline of the West, to the end of the modern world, or the triumph of amoral rapacity. But it might also be seen, as Faulkner himself indicates in the preface to The Mansion, which you read, as the chronicle of man in motion toward the good. The classical Christian tradition describing the encounter with evil, the work of man in the world, and the movement of all creation toward the eschaton is the basis of the concept of motion, I would argue, articulated in Faulkner's later work, and particularly in the Snopes trilogy. The stumbling blocks to a critical interpretation of this novel, some of which it has in common with the middle volume, The Town, are to be found in its episodic plot, radical shifts of perspective, its anecdotal method, its discursiveness, its recapitulation of earlier parts of the story told over again. We already know them if you've read the previous volumes, and hence an apparent repetitiveness. Its bewildering panoply of minor characters, some of them introduced toward the end of the novel. Sounds like Dostoevsky, maybe. Its digressions, its levity of tone, its ambivalent treatment of human behavior, its Christian paradoxes. And these characteristics are marks of the comic perspective. On the literal level, the comic action is the radical change of a dying and unnatural world by the working of grace or love. In the political order, the temperance of justice with mercy, and in the moral and spiritual dimensions, the restoration of humane existence through the experience of catastrophe, and the salvation of souls through the dramatic encounter with death and the ordeal of suffering. Think of Mink in prison, think of guilt and failure, all of these repeated and dramatized. The basis of Faulkner's comedy, like those of the comedies of Shakespeare, we might argue, are the central paradoxes of the Christian life. But they are manifested indirectly in the elements of the work itself, its language, allusion, plot, rather than in any explicit statement. Interpretation then must account not only for the actions, but for the sometimes enigmatic, discrepant, metaphysical use of language, which draws together significances by analogy. Though not always noticeable and certainly never obtrusive, words such as mansion, danger, bachelor, in fact, appear frequently. Mansion, the word doesn't appear so often, but the objects of mansions do, in fact. As I mentioned, there are 3, not 1. And Faulkner can count, so why did he say the mansion instead of the mansions? All right, so anyway, these gather every denotation and connotation of their long histories in the English language, including some which are archaic, not used much nowadays. Like the English metaphysical poets of the 17th century, and a book of Donne's poetry is prominent in The Town, the middle volume. Faulkner reveals likenesses between objects and actions of the same name that proceed from the analogy of being, rather than from mere witty verbal identities invented by an ingenious intellect. So it seems more and more apparent that the mansion deserves consideration in its own right, as a kind of resolution to the Snopes trilogy, and even to the whole corpus of Faulkner's works, though later, of course, he will write what's widely considered as his Tempest in the Reivers. So it's amazing number of parallels to the whole corpus. Let's see, it's amazing number of parallels with and allusions to some of the great works of the literary tradition: the Iliad, Dante's Commedia, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, several Shakespearean plays, a number of English lyrics, and the Brothers Karamazov certainly indicate that the novel must be studied as part of that tradition and seen analogically as imitating a spiritual action. So it's interesting because Dr. Gregory, who you may not know, had the misfortune of being my director for when I wrote the dissertation a long time ago, and it always stuck in my mind that she says these novels are about Sir Gawain meeting Helen of Troy. And Helen of Troy meeting Sir Gawain. I think that really is one way of characterizing the whole thing. So, and we know that, I mean, people might say, well, that's chronologically wrong, the way it's starting. And in fact, that was a big criticism of our order of courses at Thomas More, that in fact, the group that came in afterwards said one of the big things they did was to correct the chronology in our courses. So by not having that cyclical pattern, but just having everybody begin with the Greeks. So I guess they thought we couldn't look up the dates, but anyway, of the works. But anyway, this written over a period of 21 years and originally begun more than a decade before that, Faulkner's Snopes trilogy is nevertheless a unified depiction of a single action. The course of this action takes seems to be negative, issuing in disintegration rather than fulfillment, and numerous critics have interpreted in this fashion. However, an even larger group of readers have sensed that the concluding novel offers at least an ambiguous tone of affirmation and a sense of portentous finality. These opposing responses seem to indicate that the action of the trilogy is paradoxical in mode. It could be considered as symbolizing the decline of the West, the end of the modern world, or the triumph of amoral rapacity. But it might also be seen, as Faulkner himself indicates in the preface to The Mansion, as we saw, as the chronicle of man in motion toward the good. Beginning with a stagnant remnant of the old agrarian order in the hamlet, it moves to the modern, and he's not romantic about villages and farm life, as you may notice. It moves to the modern urbanized world of the town, and in The Mansion expands to include the human enterprise on a global scale. So we see world wars and European wars, for instance, involved. Described in the literal action of the last novel as a disturbing complex of cataclysms, disintegrations, and personal transformations. The scope of the action ranges from about 1927 to 1946. Actually, it's 48, I should say, and encompasses the end of nationalism after World War I, the abrogation of civic and moral codes, the desiccation of institutional religion, and the loss of the family as a focus of meaning. So we could see, it really struck me this time, how much of the contemporary scene is really being prophesied by him in the manner of Dostoevsky, looking ahead and seeing which way things are going. So I have a list. I thought of giving it as a quiz, because you've got all kinds of problems that are in our contemporary news today. Yeah. So All right, so then this negative course, however, is countered by a more positive one, which points to the revitalization of faith within the ruins of World War II and the incorporation of the dispossessed and lowly of the earth into the highest realms of mankind, as we will see. Spoiler alert, okay. The action of the trilogy then is appalling, even horrifying. What the reader witnesses is something like the view the church fathers had of the fall of Rome. Yet its outcome is hopeful, even joyous. The author shows how man, while seeming to regress, may actually move forward in time, taking the trouble and the sin along with him and curing it as he goes, as Faulkner put it in a late interview. Nevertheless, the decline of a civilization that we witness in the first two novels is not simply reversed in the final one. The concluding work of the trilogy gathers up all that has happened in the earlier sections and relates its themes to those in all of Faulkner's work, reassessing them in terms of the final end of man, the ultimate fulfillment, reward, and punishment of his actions on earth. And we'll see how this relates to the title, I hope. It provides a full perspective of the previous parts of the trilogy as Dante's Paradiso completes his Commedia. Finally, beyond Faulkner's own work, the mansion refers in hidden but precise ways to the literary tradition in which Faulkner is writing and to the heritage of Western civilization, seen and interpreted within a specifically Christian view of man. So, the Shakespearean critic, S.L. Bethel, said a long time ago that Shakespeare's interpretation of life harmonizes with the Christian scheme, not because he was a practicing churchman, this is a big debate nowadays, right? But because he belonged, we have somebody coming to visit who wrote a book about that, about whether Shakespeare was Catholic. But because he belonged to, which we know Faulkner was not, he did write in one letter to an uncle, I think, that it's intriguing though, you know, that church. So, but because he belonged to a Christian culture and he shows himself to be in no sense in rebellion against it. The same assertion might be made about Faulkner's work as Shakespeare's, whether or not he was Catholic, literally, but though the presence and seriousness of Christian patterns and types in his fiction might seem more debatable than in Shakespeare's, one could think. All right, so the characteristics of his novel, though, are marks of the comic perspective, these apparent contradictions, which for the most part critics still fail to discern, even those who approve of the novel and enjoy it, not only in this work, but in Faulkner's last works as a whole. On many of the same grounds, commentators of Shakespeare's late comedies have judged their eccentricities as evidence of peculiar failures, structurally and dramatically unsatisfactory, rather than works of art whose disjointed and seemingly incoherent action is essential to the startling vision they portray. These plays, particularly Measure for Measure, Winter's Tale, The Tempest, remain perhaps the most fruitful analogs to the last novels of the Snopes trilogy, in fact, elaborating similar themes and providing specific parallels to characters, situations, and actions. Central to these plays are Christian types which have their counterpart in the trilogy. You may remember the wife whose real figure is shrouded but finally revealed, and this is true of Eula, I think. The virgin who is saved from jeopardy, Linda. The genus humanus, or every man in his fallen sinfulness who must finally be forgiven. The ruler, or guardian, who oversees all, undergoes suffering, and this I think is Gavin and Ratliff are the guardian figures, as discussed last time, the teacher and the poet. More important than these individual elements is both authors turn to the Christian patterns of comedy, whose form at times necessitates radical and inexplicable metamorphosis. So Mink, as we saw last time, for instance, the spiritual transformation that he undergoes, and he's not the only one. The action particularly evident in Shakespeare's late comedies resembles the visible and invisible action of the mansion, or vice versa, I should say. On the literal level, the radical change of a dying and unnatural world by the working of grace or love. In the political order, the temperance of justice with mercy. And in the moral and spiritual dimensions, the restoration of humane existence through the experience of catastrophe, and the salvation of souls through the dramatic encounter with death and the ordeal of suffering. In the elaboration of these themes, Shakespeare, as Neville Coggle and others have asserted, works in the tradition of medieval comedy, Chaucerian and Dantesque, in a ritualistic and somewhat allegorical mode, having its bases largely in the Gospels and the Pauline epistles. So, I think Faulkner then comes out of that tradition. The basis of Faulkner's comedy, like those of the comedies of Shakespeare and Dante, are the central paradoxes of the Christian life, but they are manifested indirectly in the elements of the work itself, its language, allusion, plot, rather than in any explicit statement. In a real sense, then, his stance is Pauline and Augustinian there. Think about the fall of Rome and the disasters around that Augustine witnessed. The victory of the spirit over the letter, of life and motion over stasis and death, is the chief mimetic action then of the mansion, to which all the parts of the novel conform. The manifestation of the invisible spiritual action and the regeneration of a death-bound world is the traditional comic action apparent in both these authors. The author implies in his preface to the mansion that he has himself witnessed the transformation of his characters. He says, I've known them now these decades, and I see discrepancies. I see more discrepancies in my work than you would, because I've known them so long, and I've learned more about them. He's come to know more about the human heart and its dilemma, as he calls it, that he hopes his reader will not read merely according to the letter, noticing excessively literal contradictions and discrepancies among the three novels. What he seems implicitly to demand of his reader is that he too, like the author, be attentive to the action of spirit, the motion, that is, in all its dimensions. So the meanings within these novels are revealed in an allegorical and analogical way, then, like that of Dante and other writers in the medieval tradition, rather in the naturalistic and highly symbolic mode of his earlier works. So rather than limit the work to a fixed order of ideas he proposes, an allegory allows the play of tone, style, while suggesting levels of meaning and manifold analogies within the story. So one can discuss the large design only in reading these levels of meaning, which Faulkner makes clear by analogy within the work itself. His method here is to bring into motion of transformation the types and events of the earlier works. So we see all of these retellings, but they're done from a different vantage point. We can see how the meaning might be different than maybe was first seen or thought to be, as well as a figurative language by which they can be arrested for contemplation and paradoxically freed to manifest their reality. So Faulkner's comic vision is reflected in his use of words with rich historic, in one way, that is not the only way, but one that kind of captures us, his use of words with rich historic connotations in the literary tradition. Though not always noticeable and certainly never obtrusive, words such as mansion, bachelor, and danger appear frequently and take on every denotation or connotation in their histories. So the rich experience which they connote is brought to life again and gathered into motion, so that it is not necessarily consciously to recognize their old meanings any more than it is necessary. So he didn't have to know the dictionary histories of these words because they'd already entered, I think, into the experience of human action. So he may or may not have looked them up in the dictionary, as I had to do, and to see. All right, with the motion that he refers to, from law to spirit, death to life, the title is intricately connected. Because mansion refers to a dwelling in a particular place, it seems unrelated, if not contradictory to the assertion in the introduction that the novel, as well as the characters within it, participate in motion, and that the only alternative to motion is unmotion, stasis, and death, as he says. But actually, the implications of the title qualify his definitions of life, death, stasis, and motion, which are to be interpreted not only literally. And it's clear there's motion, which is effectively stasis, only literal, random, and pointless, therefore moribund action. On the other hand, there's a stasis, which is really motion, a cessation of purposeless activity, which places one in spiritual motion and so gives life. So the title indicates that the life-giving motion is orderly and purposeful. A mansion is a place where one dwells in temporary rest and lives a communal life, but paradoxically, a communal existence implies a death to self and a participation in spiritual motion. So Mink will have a kind of experience of mansion by being imprisoned for 38 years. So a consideration of the rich metaphorical history of the word mansion, the word has had in the language, has not been discussed still. I've been looking around in the method of the novel. So, and you've encountered a mansion before, right? In the first short story, you read at the first meeting, the transformation of Sardi Snopes is when he sees that vision of the mansion. And then he enters into it and there's a lady there. He's never seen one before. And so these are medieval, connections that really are transformative. And Dr. Cowan, by the way, did a wonderful speech at the dedication of our library, using that story as telling about the experience of liberal education. So yeah, because Sardi sees it and he's transformed. He says, they're free of him, meaning his father, and he hopes his father will recognize that too, as you remember. And that doesn't happen to him. He doesn't have the right. He's meant to arouse envy in his son rather than generosity of spirit and wonder. And it's interesting because he thinks then, well, they're safe from him, which is what students tend to do. And then he discovers, well, maybe they're not unless I intervene and prevent my father from burning that barn. So it's what students do once they have that sense of wonderment, and then they realize they participate. They're called on to participate, or the culture that was so transformative could be lost if they don't take up the burden. And so he does. So a consideration of the rich metaphorical, anyway, the Oxford English Dictionary lists a myriad of meanings to the word mansion that has been applied in an analogous sense. Each of these plays some part in the mansion to form a network that unites the apparently disparate parts into a whole. The word mansion has been used in the history of our language in several senses, now archaic, but which are still potential or indirectly manifest in present-day English. In its root sense, as well as in the most derived meanings, it indicates rest within motion, or motion within rest. So we've got that reference to motion from the opening of the novel. And of course, the word mansion comes from the Latin, manere, to stay or remain. And remaining becomes an important experience, more explicitly referred to in the town, actually, when Gavin says at one point, remaining must remain. And there's a lot that I haven't gotten to on that because, for instance, I know von Balthasar has his opening to Seeing the Form, which I'm not sure was translated way back when I studied it, but I discovered it. He talks about the action of remaining, in fact, in the gospel, which I or somebody should go back to and maybe reflect upon. So, to say that anyway, the word has been used to refer to a pause for a night during a journey. So instead of saying it's so many 4 days journey, you say it's 4 rests and for the night. Okay, so to say destination is 4 mansions away is quantitatively the same as saying it's 4 days away, but a journey which is measured by rests, by the pauses in which one takes account of the progress made during the day and prepares for further action, gives a shade of meaning that sheds a comic light on the experience of journeying. It indicates, if you will, a contemplative side of the journey, a pause on the pilgrimage of life in which the motion itself is reinterpreted, celebrated, or renewed. The word mansion has been used also to refer to the amount of land on which it is possible to support a family. But as the use of the word in this technical economic sense was adopted into English, it was used only to measure units of ecclesiastical land. So in other words, it refers properly to the material holdings of an organization, such as a parish or monastery, dedicated to the spiritual life, a physical milieu in which the growth of the spirit is particularly fostered. Coincidence? I think not. Yet another definition is mansion understood as an apartment or a unit of living quarters within a large building. In this literal sense of the word has been, for the most part, lost, but it is nevertheless employed in many translations of the Gospel of St. John to express Christ's promise to his disciples, "In my Father's house there are many mansions." And then to go on, the word thus used to signify the resting place of the soul in heaven is substantiated by other comparisons within the Gospels to the house as the soul's residence, wherein the feast of love takes place. So St. Teresa of Avila says in her work, The Interior Castle, "I began to think of the soul as if it were a castle in which there are many rooms, just as in heaven there are many mansions." So now all of these I think we'll see, and I think it would be interesting during the discussion to look at passages in which the soul is referred to in the novel itself. I don't know if you noticed, because some of them are kind of surprising, such as Linda's soul is compared to a ball that a seal balances on its nose. And she has to keep it up there balanced above the smutch of Snopesism so it doesn't get tainted. So these are playful, and not the kind of thing you would find maybe in the catechism, but I think Faulkner is recognizing that, but he's giving us some very concrete images here. So the literal use of the word mansion is employed in the novel includes a spiritual level. All the older meanings of the word mansion, as it is most ordinarily used, refers to a great house, and we still use it for that, the seat of an estate, presumably both a place of leisure and headquarters of the most responsible activity, the center of stewardship. So the title of the novel is singular, yet it contains 3 buildings, the novel does, which might fit this description or this name, each of them having a somewhat different function in the novel. So, as I say, the Old Frenchman's Place, the Despain Mansion that Clem gets hold of, and the Harris Mansion, as you'll see in the last reading. So which one is it? Or maybe is it actually that he's trying to define the experience of a mansion in English in various analogous ways? So anyway, the Despain Mansion, apparently the one Ab Snopes was evicted from a long time before. We've just got all of this history. So that house is finally an old curiosity. It's with its fake columns in imitation of Mount Vernon. It is the solid aristocratic ancestral symbol of Alexander Hamilton, it said. And Aaron Burr and Astor and Morgan and Harriman and Hill and every other golden advocate of hard, quick-thinking, vested interest.
Oh, wow.
So it's finally an old curiosity, a tawdry imitation of the aristocratic magnificence that Will Varner and Flem have never comprehended. So does that mean it doesn't exist as an entity or that experience? I think Faulkner's saying yes, it does, even though it's often misunderstood and sullied and corrupted. So at the end of the novel, Linda Snopes gives the deed to that house that she inherits to the only members of the Despain family she can find, and Ratliff is amused and says, they can't even afford to keep it up. He argues they may have to undertake immoral activities to support the house, this free gift. So anyway, Charles Mallison, Gavin Stevens' nephew, who acts as one of the central narrative voices in the novel, tells us that the original Bacchus plantation belonged to Melissandra's Bacchus plantation, gangster husband, and was turned into a Long Island horse farm, and it's also changed radically. It too has changed radically, and so from all of this money. But it has been altered by the New England gangsters' money, as old Snopes had tried to do with the Despain house. So I think it's not just those particular literal mansions that he's referring to, in fact, but some state of being, in fact. So, all right, now So Gavin's reward of being given ever greater opportunities for suffering and service, such as being given inheriting a mansion from his wife, is well described by Ratliff, who tells Gavin one day that he envies him his luck. That is his ability to be completely immersed in 24 hours in a day being busy. Ratliff explains that such total preoccupation with one's work is a rare privilege. So we see in the mansion, as you saw in the short story in Barn Burning, the house is, remember the lady comes down and she's in this beautiful gray dress, but her hands are covered with flour, right? Of course, the word lady, where that comes from in English. I'm sorry, somebody does. Loaf maker? And levity, the medieval term, it's loaf maker. And they say English is the only language, apparently, that actually uses that word. So in Latin, you have domina, and that there we see more that kind of root for it, but the loaf maker, and then clavert is loaf giver. So she makes the bread and he distributes it. So they are people who are responsible for others. They may dwell in a mansion, but that gives them a calling, in fact. Noblesse oblige, huh? Yeah. All right, so Gavin's, inheriting the mansion. They keep saying once he's married, he won't be dangerous anymore. You may have noticed. They keep hoping he'll get married, but that doesn't work because he finally gets married and he's just as dangerous as he ever was. So we could also explore that word danger, which has so many meanings. Sometimes they have put themselves in danger to take bread at my hand, And so many references. Yeah, we could explore that all the way through. So Gavin's reward then is more work, it would seem, and responsibility. A consideration of the meaning of his newly acquired property suggests that in giving the title The Mansion to the novel, Faulkner is restoring the image to its fuller analogical and even anagogical dimensions, such as we saw in the images of the soul and the union with Christ. As a lawyer who becomes steward of a house that was furnished with ill-gotten goods, he finds his work is a matter of redeeming his surroundings. So the strange title then of The Mansion, with its implication of leisure and stillness and spiritual activity, is in accord with the equation of life with motion, just as he calls it. Just as Faulkner in the preface points to the maturation of understanding, the novel portrays mimetically an ever-changing and deepening knowledge of the human heart and of the efficacy in the world of love. And Gavin's real mansions, however, are the spirits of those of whom he takes charge, and that's another meaning of the word mansion. We saw meaning used by St. Teresa in the Gospel of John, maybe. What makes him seem ridiculous at times is not that he is, his manners are archaic, as it seems, and we were talking a little bit about his shock at the words that the younger generation used to describe certain human relations, and so he is that, has this code of courtesy. But that he is a sensitive lover who looks forward to spiritual transformations that have not yet taken place. And so he is, as Dr. Cowan pointed out last time, the teacher figure we see in the novel. So Ratliff explains, it wasn't that he was born too soon or too late, or even in the wrong place. He was born at exactly, because he looks so out of place. It was that he was in exactly the right time, only in the wrong envelope. It was his fate and doom not to have been born in one of the Macara separate covers too, instead of into that fragile and what you might call gossamer-sinewed envelope of boundless and hopeless aspiration old Master give him. So he dwells in an envelope that of his, I think, his own spirit. Does not St. Thomas, I meant to look this up or ask somebody who knows, does he not say there's a certain sense in which the soul is not within us, but we're in our souls? I think he did. Anyway, gotta look that up, because I have heard that. But anyway, so he's in this envelope of his own spirit, which rather than removing him from harm and protecting him, actually makes him vulnerable to the world and to other spirits. Gavin's personal enclosure and its paradoxical effect is very like that which Mink remembers was bestowed upon him as a child by his stepmother, as we see in when he's, So it's not even his mother, but his stepmother, and you remember that she's been beaten by her husband again, and so she said, I just can't eat what we've got in the house. And he says, he goes out and hunts that squirrel, and and brings it back, and she says, we'll relish it together. And this is the memory that comes back to him unbidden, as he is about to go and fulfill his apparent calling. So anyway, the description of that relation, not his own mother, biological mother, but his stepmother, he could always depend on her, not to do anything for him because she always failed there, but for constancy, to be always there and always aware of him, surrounding him always with that shield which actually defended him from nothing, but on the contrary seemed actually to invite more pain and grief. So it's a lot like Gavin's envelope, I think. So you see in Faulkner, and especially in Go Down Noses, all of these references to adopted parents, uncles, teacher figures, spiritual parents, and of course you see that in Dostoevsky too. And Alyosha has two fathers, Sam. Go Down Noses has two fathers. So the woman wasn't no kin at all to Mink, yet she recognizes in the child the preciousness of a soul to be saved. And she let him know, as we're told, that she takes him to church as a child, and she lets him know that she does what she does for him because she's a Christian. And surrounding him like a shield, this personhood, draws him into motion so that he's not divorced from experience but exposed to it fully with all its attendant pain and grief. Mink's place in the universe is finally determined not by the social status of his family, but by the spiritual dwelling bestowed on him by another, which mediates his relationship with the world. And like Gavin's, his envelope, his particular gift of vulnerability is the fate which shapes his existence and his ends, as it turns out. And I don't have a clock, do I?
You've got one behind you there.
Oh, okay. There's no escape. Oh no, talk fast. Okay. So Gavin believes that one's very appearance and demeanor are...
It's just 7. It's just 7. It says
Pardon?
8.
Yes, it hasn't been changed.
Oh, that's... Don't talk quite as fast. Okay. So Gavin believes that one's very appearance and demeanor are an embodiment of what Ratliff calls his envelope, and so are signs of his spiritual responsibilities. Anguishing over Eula's suicide, Gavin asks Ratliff, why did she do it, VK? This is in the mansion. The suicide occurs in the town, and it's revisited in the mansion. All that she walked in, lived in, breathed in, it was only loaned to her. It wasn't hers to destroy and throw away. It belonged to too many. It belonged to all of us. So much for the body just being our possession, according to Ratliff. As Gavin's spirit determines his responsibility for the spirits of others, so they in turn are responsible for their manner of dwelling in the world and in the body itself, which is traditionally called the mansion of the spirit or the soul. The very aura, the detailed dwelling of a man, even his body, joins him to a community rather than, and thus, to communal responsibilities. The more gifts one has, the more responsible he is. The building of a literal mansion signifies the spiritual responsibilities of all men, all persons, though they can be exercised only by a few on the literal level. So it seems, anyway. The mansion of a man is an aura that he dwells in, his relationship with the rest of the world, as I say, which makes him vulnerable. So with the growth of materialism and the secular world that Faulkner describes in the mansion, such an envelope appears to some onlookers to be a means of separation from the world and from motion, instead of a way of entering into them, as he gives us to see. As though to illustrate the difference between Gavin and some of his fellows, Faulkner includes Chick Mallison's account of his bomber pilot a friend whose nickname is Plex. I don't know if you noticed him. Another minor character gets thrown in there. We never see him again. Anyway, it was short for plexiglass, you may have noticed. He's a sort of mad prophet, warning the world of the danger of such isolation of the spirit as he seems represented in plexiglass, cellophane, things like that. He had an obsession, this is a quotation, on the subject of cellophane, which was newly invented in the 20th century, amounting to a phobia. The simple sight or even the mere idea of a new pack of cigarettes or a new shirt or a handkerchief, as he had to buy them now pre-encased in the invisible, impenetrable cocoon, threw him into a sort of virulent, almost hysterical frenzy into which Charles had seen the idea of Germans or Japanese throw some civilians, especially those around 50 years old. For plexiglass, cellophane packaging suggests the spirit of isolation which has caused the war he is fighting in. I don't know if he knew about plastic poisoning. Worried about now, you know, how much plastic we swallow in a year, not just get wrapped in. So Gavin's dearest mansion, besides the spirit of Eula Varner, is that of her daughter Linda. He sees that she's given the opportunity for a spiritual love. A sign of that union of love is the apartment or mansion, in the old sense, in which she shares with Barton Cole, and from which they are eventually married and enter the war, where the husband is killed in exercising the responsibility the lovers have held in common. Barton Cole moves from this temporal dwelling to his death, and Linda in her lifelong state of mourning, which Gavin recognizes as her calling. So Gavin has attempted to educate her by forming her mind, as his twin sister says, with conversations and with John Donne's poems, and by witnessing to her through his fidelity, her worth. He prepares her toward the end to which she constantly points, towards her mysterious doom, by seeing that she leave Jefferson and Flem Snopes, her supposed father. And I don't know what you think, this is something we might talk about, because you'll notice that Gavin, one reason she loves him is that he always lies to her about whether Flem is her father. She says, or who her father is, yeah. And he never will tell her the literal truth, though he invites her father, original father, to her wedding reception, but never will admit that's her father. Okay, so interesting. So Ratliff recognizes that Gavin is laboring for Linda's immortal soul. He says that, though everyone else in Jefferson suspects that he is interested in educating more than her mind. Contradicting the rumor that Gavin had wanted to marry her, Ratliff in the Mansion interprets Gavin's relationship with the young girl in the previous novel. Just marriage wouldn't have been worth his effort. He had to be the sole one masculine feller within her entire possible circumambience, not just to recognize she had a soul still capable of being saved from what he called Snopesism, a force and power that stout and evil as to jeopardize it just from her believing for 12 or 13 years she was blood kin, when she actively wasn't no kin at all, but that couldn't nobody else in range and reach but him save it. That her glass bubble thing somewhere inside her, like one of them shimmer-colored balls balanced on the seal's nose. Fragile yet immune, too, just that one constant fragile inch above the smudge and dirt of Snopes, as long as the seal don't trip or stumble or let her attention wander. So there's all of this carrying one's soul around. Now I don't know, I really do have to let you go, but it seems to me that there are so many themes that really jumped out. I think its connection now, liberal education, obviously. What does Gavin want for Linda? There's prison ministry. You may remember Mink doesn't join the congregations that the authorities in the prison expect him to when he converts. In fact, he says, I've taken it in confidence. But they're kind of respectable institutions within there, and there's homeschooling or ice cream parlor schooling. There are elections, and there's C. Eggleston Snopes who gets into office in there. There's insomnia in Memphis when Mink gets there. He says, this is a city doesn't sleep all night. People look for some kind of nameless pleasure. There's gun violence, there's world war, there's spiritual warfare, There's boredom. One explanation of Eula's suicide is maybe she was just bored. Turns out probably not that. Suicide itself, drug addiction, pornography, child trafficking, Pharisaism, the deep state. That's phlegm, I think, but also that agent who comes in that investigating Linda, and Gavin just despises him. He's there in the name of security, trying to catch her and observe her and monitor her. And when Gavin doesn't think she's dangerous. Homelessness and destitution even, clerical abuse. Mink thinks that's what clerics are.